The leather in seat 12F cost more than 3 months of Marcus Thompson's rent. He knew because he'd calculated it while buckling his 6-year-old son Isaiah into the business class seat. A veteran's courtesy upgrade. Neither of them looked like they belonged in. Isaiah's fingers clutched a scratched F-22 model, its paint chipped from 1,000 imaginary battles, while Marcus's worn work jacket bore the ghost of oil stains no amount of washing could erase. Victoria Sterling's perfume arrived before she did, settling into the adjacent seat with the kind of sigh that said everything her polished lips didn't need to. "They really should have separate sections," she murmured to her phone, eyes sliding over Marcus's calloused hands like they were something contagious. The flight attendant's smile fractured at the edges when she offered Marcus the warm towel, a hairline crack in her professional facade. Marcus absorbed it all in silence. The stares, the whispers, the careful distance others kept. His jaw tightened only once when his thumb traced the faded inscription on the steel band circling his wrist, Reaper 6. 2 words that once meant everything, now hidden under the sleeve of a man the world had learned to overlook. But 30,000 feet below, on a military runway neither of them could see yet, a truth waited in formation. And when it stood to salute, everyone in that cabin, especially Victoria Sterling, would learn that the cost of a seat means nothing compared to the price some men pay in silence. Marcus had stopped explaining himself years ago. People saw the frayed collar and discount sneakers and made their judgments. Isaiah pressed his nose against the window, toy fighter jet clutched tight, a thrift store find from 3 years ago, the same week Marcus had sold his flight jacket to pay for preschool uniforms. That jacket had his call sign embroidered on the chest, Reaper 6. The steel band on his wrist bore the same engraving, a gift from his wife the day he'd made squadron leader, back when the future felt solid instead of smoke. Victoria's phone conversation droned on. Quarterly projections, incompetent contractors, defense contracts. Her company supplied avionics systems to the Air Force. She spoke about pilots like data points, aircraft like investment portfolios. No reverence for the human beings those machines carried home to waiting families. The flight attendant returned with menus, handing Victoria hers first before hesitating at Marcus. "Will you be dining with us today, sir?" The question carried unspoken doubt. Marcus met her gaze steadily. "We'll both have the chicken. Thank you." Isaiah stirred, his mother's gray eyes fluttering open before sleep claimed him again. Victoria ended her call and assessed her surroundings with an inventory-taking glance that reduced everything to price tags. Her eyes landed on Isaiah's toy. "Those things are so loud when kids play with them. I once endured a 5-hour flight next to a child who wouldn't stop making airplane noises." She laughed. Ice cubes and crystal. The businessman across the aisle chuckled in solidarity. Marcus absorbed the blow like he always did, focusing on the warmth of his son against his shoulder. Defending himself only gave people ammunition. Better to stay silent, stay small, stay invisible in spaces that made clear he didn't belong. The engines began their pre-flight whine, a sound that used to thrill Marcus down to his bones. Now, it just reminded him of everything he'd lost. This was a Boeing 737, late 2000s model. He knew every sound and system from his months as a civilian consultant, designing emergency procedures for this exact aircraft. That job had paid for 2 months of rent and Isaiah's dental work before the contract ended, and he'd returned to fixing cars at Precision Auto, where the only thing that flew was the occasional wrench. The captain announced their flight time to Houston. Marcus wondered if the man had military training or came up through civilian ranks. Learning in small Cessnas instead of screaming through sky at twice the speed of sound. Takeoff came with the familiar press of acceleration. Isaiah's hand found his father's, squeezing tight as the ground fell away and the world tilted into clouds. Marcus had flown this route dozens of times in his previous life. Now he saw it as a tourist would, distant and disconnected, a place he used to belong but couldn't access anymore. Victoria pulled out her tablet, fingers moving with corporate efficiency across spreadsheets and project timelines, numbers representing more money than Marcus would see in his lifetime. She erected a wall of busyness that said she was too important for trivial things like human connection. Marcus had met people like her during his years in uniform, contractors who toured bases with designer luggage, took photos with jets they'd never fly, then complained about accommodations. They treated service members like obstacles between them and profit margins. The flight attendant returned with drinks. Victoria's sparkling water arrived in actual glass, while Marcus's coffee came in standard paper with a plastic lid. Small distinctions that added up to larger messages about who mattered. Isaiah sipped his juice carefully, eyes fixed on the clouds. "Dad," he whispered, "do you think Mom can see us from up here?" The question landed in Marcus's chest like shrapnel. He took a slow breath. "I think she can see us from anywhere, buddy. That's how love works." Victoria glanced over at them, curiosity or morbid interest flickering across her face. Marcus felt her gaze assessing and dismissing simultaneously. She saw oil stains and assumed incompetence, thrift store clothes and assumed laziness, silence and assumed emptiness. What she didn't see was the man he'd been before grief and trauma had carved him down to this quieter version. The countless hours in simulators, the split-second decisions that had saved lives, the expertise that still lived in his hands even when the world refused to recognize it. The flight settled into cruising altitude. Isaiah returned to his toy, moving it through careful loops above his tray table, sound effects barely audible now after Victoria's displeasure. Marcus watched his son play and felt the familiar ache of inadequacy. He should give this boy more. Better clothes and newer toys, a home without water-stained ceilings. But all he had was love and presence, and stubborn refusal to let shame make him smaller. Victoria's tablet chimed with an incoming call. "Yes, I'm reviewing the contract now. The specifications are completely unacceptable. I don't care what their reputation is. If they can't meet our quality standards, they don't get the contract. We're talking about military equipment, not toys." She emphasized the last word with particular disdain, and Isaiah shrank beside his father, understanding he and his beloved jet had been reduced to metaphors for inadequacy. Marcus's jaw clenched. But what would defending his son accomplish? Victoria would offer empty apologies, and Isaiah would learn his father's words carried no weight here. So Marcus pulled his son closer, a silent message that they had each other, even when the world insisted they had nothing. The captain's voice returned. But something in his tone had shifted, a tightness Marcus's trained ear caught immediately. "Folks, we're making an unscheduled landing at Fort Stockton Air Force Base due to a technical issue. Nothing to be alarmed about, just a precautionary measure. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin." Victoria's fingers froze, her polished composure cracking. Other passengers reached for phones, their irritation palpable, but Marcus felt cold recognition settling into his bones. Technical issues requiring military landings weren't minor. The pilot was keeping calm for passengers, but Marcus heard the subtext, something serious enough to override standard protocols. Isaiah looked up, eyes wide. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Marcus smoothed the worry from his face. "Everything's fine, buddy. We're just taking a different path home." The descent began steeper than normal, and Marcus's hands wanted to reach for controls that weren't there, muscle memory overriding common sense. He could feel the pilot working harder than he should, probably fighting hydraulic issues or asymmetric thrust. The other passengers didn't notice, but Victoria had clutched her armrest, knuckles white, her expensive tablet forgotten. For a moment, she was just another human confronting mortality, stripped of the armor wealth provided. The wheels touched down harder than ideal, but controlled, and the plane decelerated with the whine of reverse thrust. Applause broke out, that nervous relief people express when they've been afraid without admitting it. Marcus didn't clap. He was too busy cataloging every sound, every vibration. his brain running through post-flight checklists he hadn't used in years but couldn't forget. Fort Stockton Air Force Base stretched beyond the windows, hangars and maintenance buildings, control towers and radar installations. The organized chaos of military infrastructure designed for readiness. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, a door he'd kept locked for 5 years. This was the world he'd walked away from when the nightmares got too loud and doctors told him he was no longer fit for active duty. Isaiah pressed his face to the window, toy jet forgotten as he stared at real aircraft in the distance, fighters and transports, the machinery of national defense. "Dad," Isaiah breathed, "are those F-22s?" Marcus followed his son's gaze, throat tightening. "Yes, F-22 Raptors, the most advanced fighters in the American arsenal." Aircraft. Marcus had flown when they were so new the manual was still being written. A uniformed officer stepped aboard, his presence shifting the atmosphere from civilian complaint to military precision. He conferred with the flight crew, then addressed passengers with calm authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, our maintenance team is inspecting the aircraft. You're welcome to deplane and wait in our passenger terminal." Victoria was already on her phone, voice sharp as she rescheduled meetings. Marcus helped Isaiah with his backpack, moving slowly, reluctant in a way he couldn't name. Being back on a military installation made him feel like a ghost visiting his own funeral. They filed into bright Texas sun, heat hitting them like a wall after the climate-controlled cabin. The terminal was sparse and functional. Metal chairs, vending machines, windows overlooking the flight line where aircraft sat in various stages of readiness. Victoria claimed a chair near an outlet, creating a bubble of importance. Marcus found a quiet corner where Isaiah could play without bothering anyone, his own attention drawn toward the windows and the world beyond them. Isaiah spread out on the floor with his toy, creating rescue missions and aerial battles. Soft sound effects a counterpoint to adult conversations. Marcus sat beside him, back against the wall, letting himself sink into his son's imagination, where heroes always won and nobody judged you by your clothes. A few passengers glanced their way, a black man in an expensive suit sitting on industrial carpet with a child and thrift store toy. And Marcus could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. Victoria looked over once, her expression suggesting she'd smelled something unpleasant, then returned to her phone. An hour passed, then 90 minutes. Victoria's phone calls increased in volume. She'd positioned herself as unofficial spokesperson for passenger grievances, demanding updates from personnel with no authority to provide them and threatening legal action. Marcus watched this performance with the detachment of someone who'd seen actual emergencies. Victoria was terrified beneath the anger, terrified of being powerless, of being subject to forces beyond her control. Wealth and status couldn't fix a broken airplane. So she did what people like her always did, tried to buy her way out with volume and indignation. Isaiah had abandoned his toy for the windows. Small hands pressed against glass as he watched an F-22 crew work with precise movements. Marcus stood beside his son, attention captured by details he couldn't help cataloging. The stabilizer angles, the weapons bay check, the intake port inspection. He knew every inch of that aircraft, had pushed it to its limits, had trusted his life to the engineering. "That's the coolest plane ever," Isaiah said. Marcus smiled despite himself. "Yeah, buddy, it really is." Behind them, Victoria's latest conversation had attracted attention. "I don't care about protocol," she was saying. "I have a meeting with Pentagon procurement I cannot miss. Surely someone has the authority to arrange alternative transport." She'd cornered a lieutenant with the full force of her corporate entitlement. The young officer maintained professional composure. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but we need to follow proper safety procedures." Victoria's face flushed. "Do you know who I am? My company supplies half the avionics systems your precious Air Force uses. I could make one phone call." And she stopped mid-sentence, as something over the lieutenant's shoulder caught her attention. Three pilots had entered the terminal in flight suits, heading toward vending machines with casual squadron camaraderie. Marcus felt himself involuntarily straighten. He knew these men, not individually, but collectively, the culture they came from, the training that shaped them, the unspoken codes. One of them, a major with gray threading his dark hair, glanced around the terminal with assessing eyes, trained to evaluate threats and opportunities in seconds. His gaze passed over Victoria, over other passengers, then stopped dead on Marcus. Something flickered in his expression. Then his eyes dropped to Marcus's wrist, to the steel band that had shifted during the wait, exposing just enough of the engraving to be visible. The major's entire demeanor changed. He said something quick to his companions, then walked directly toward Marcus with purpose. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, that old fight-or-flight response kicking in. Isaiah sensed the shift and moved closer, protective instinct. The major stopped at a respectful distance, eyes moving from the steel band to Marcus's face and back. "Excuse me, sir. I don't mean to intrude, but—" He gestured toward Marcus's wrist. "Is that call sign yours? Or are you wearing someone else's memorial band?" The question hung respectful but direct, giving Marcus the option to deflect. Around them, the terminal had gone quiet. Victoria had stopped mid-complaint. Marcus's throat felt like sandpaper. He hadn't said his call sign aloud in years, hadn't claimed that identity since discharge papers. But something about this moment, standing on a military base with his son beside him and that F-22 visible through the window, made lying feel like betrayal. His voice came out rough, scarred by disuse. "It's mine, Reaper 6. The major's expression shifted through several emotions, landing on something like awe mixed with respect. He straightened to attention, hands snapping up in a crisp salute. "Sir, it's an honor." His two companions moved closer, casual demeanor evaporating. One of them, a captain who looked barely old enough to shave, stared at Marcus like he'd just seen a legend step out of a history book. The other, a lieutenant colonel with combat ribbons, had gone very still, eyes sharp with recognition. Marcus stood slowly, body remembering protocol even as his mind scrambled to catch up. Returning a salute out of uniform felt wrong, but not returning it felt worse. He brought his hand up in the gesture that had once been natural as breathing. The terminal had transformed into something else, no longer civilian space, but military, governed by different rules. Victoria was staring, phone forgotten. Earlier complaints rendered meaningless by a ritual she didn't understand, but could feel the weight of. The major lowered his salute, but didn't break eye contact. "Sir, I flew my qualification mission with Captain Martinez. She spoke about you all the time. Said you were the best squadron leader she'd ever served under." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Captain Alicia Martinez, his wingman, his wife, the woman who died in a training accident while he'd been grounded with injury, unable to fly chase for her, unable to do anything but listen to the radio as her jet malfunctioned and her voice remained calm until the very end. Isaiah had gone quiet beside his father, processing that something important was happening. Marcus's hand found his son's shoulder, grounding himself. "Captain Martinez was my wife." The major's expression crumpled with understanding, pieces falling into place, the civilian clothes, the child. The reason Reaper 6 was sitting on a terminal floor instead of leading a squadron. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know." Marcus shook his head. "You couldn't have known." "It's been a long time." The lieutenant colonel stepped forward, voice gentle. "Sir, what brings you to Fort Stockton?" Marcus gestured toward the terminal. "Our flight had mechanical issues. We're waiting to continue to Houston." The pilots exchanged glances. The captain spoke up, grin making him look younger. "Sir, you were at Nellis, right? Part of the team that developed the current tactical manual for close air support." Marcus blinked, surprised. "That was 8 years ago. How do you—" The captain's face split wider. "Sir, that's still the manual we use. Your scenarios are legendary. We study your mission recordings in advanced training. This is Reaper 6. The Reaper 6. The Major cut him off with a look. Reminder that some things remained classified, but the damage was done. Other passengers were watching now. Really watching, trying to reconcile the man they'd dismissed with the picture these pilots painted. Victoria had gone pale, earlier disdain transforming into something that might have been shame or dawning realization that she'd spent 2 hours insulting someone whose boots she wasn't qualified to shine. The lieutenant colonel glanced toward the windows. "Sir, would you and your son like to see the flight line? We have about an hour before our next brief. Some of the squadron would appreciate meeting you." It was phrased as a question, but Marcus heard the deeper offer. Temporary return to the world he'd left. Chance to show Isaiah the man his father used to be. Marcus looked down at his son, who was staring up with wonder and confusion. "Want to see a real fighter jet up close?" Isaiah's response was immediate and enthusiastic. The pilot smiled. Genuine warmth. Military personnel reserved for their own and for children. 2 groups they were sworn to protect. They emerged onto the tarmac, Texas heat wrapping around them, smell of jet fuel and hot concrete so familiar it made Marcus's chest ache. Isaiah bounced on his toes, exhaustion forgotten. The F-22 was more impressive up close. Angular lines designed to defeat radar, its shape a threat to enemies and promise to allies. The ground crew paused their tasks, curious. The captain jogged ahead to the crew chief, explaining something that made the older sergeant's eyebrows rise. She turned to look at Marcus, studied him, then nodded and waved them forward. Isaiah approached the aircraft with reverence, small hand reaching but not quite touching. The crew chief, a woman in her 40s with sergeant stripes and a name tape reading Rodriguez, crouched to Isaiah's level. "You like jets, kid?" Isaiah nodded, speechless. Rodriguez smiled. "This one's the best. Want to know a secret? This jet, tail number 775, was flown by one of the best pilots the Air Force ever had. Guy named Reaper 6. Isaiah's eyes went wide. He looked at his father, then back at Rodriguez. "That's my dad. That's his name." Rodriguez's expression shifted to something deeper. She straightened, looked at Marcus properly. The worn clothes, tired eyes, steel band. "Is that right?" Marcus nodded, unable to trust his voice. Rodriguez studied him a moment longer. "Chief Rodriguez, I was crew chief for this bird during the Syria deployment. You brought her back with half her systems down and 3 feet of one wing missing. I didn't think it was possible." The memory rushed back. Cockpit warnings screaming. Alicia on the radio talking him through it because she could read his flying better than anyone. Her voice steady as Marcus fought controls and physics. He'd been responsible for 6 crew members' lives that day. When they'd finally touched down, emergency vehicles surrounding them, Marcus had sat unable to move. Alicia had climbed up and pulled him out herself, held him while he shook. 3 months later, she was gone. Rodriguez gestured to her team, who pulled over a maintenance ladder. "Want to see the cockpit, kid?" Isaiah's face answered before words could. The major helped lift Isaiah onto the ladder. The boy climbed with careful determination, his father's hand steady on his back. The canopy had been opened for maintenance, and Isaiah disappeared into the cockpit. Marcus followed, body remembering the climb, exact placement of hands and feet. Isaiah was touching everything, the stick, throttle, display screens. "Dad," he whispered, "you flew this? Really?" Marcus settled on the cockpit edge, close enough for safety, far enough to let him explore. "Yeah, buddy, I really flew it." Victoria had followed onto the tarmac, keeping distance but unable to look away. She'd abandoned her phone in anger, both rendered irrelevant. Marcus saw her standing there, arms crossed, expensive clothes marking her as foreign to this environment in ways his poverty never could. Money meant nothing here. What mattered was competence and courage and willingness to sacrifice everything for the person next to you. Currencies she didn't trade in, values her world had taught her to dismiss. She'd built an empire on defense contracts while viewing defenders with contempt, never understanding the machines she sold were only as good as the people who flew them. Now she was watching one of those people show his son a legacy she'd never comprehend. The look on her face suggested she was beginning to understand how badly she'd miscalculated worth. The lieutenant colonel stepped forward. "Sir, the squadron would be honored if you'd join us in the ready room. There are people who'd like to meet you." It was another door opening into a past Marcus had tried to seal, but Isaiah was looking at him with such pride that Marcus found himself nodding. They climbed down, Isaiah's hand tight in his father's. Rodriguez caught Marcus's arm. "Sir, I don't know what brought you here today, but I'm glad it did. These kids need to see what they're trying to become, someone who lived it and survived it and carried the scars." She paused. "Someone who chose to keep going when everything said to quit." The walk to the ready room felt like traveling backward through time. Marcus could navigate this base blind, feet finding paths his mind had forgotten. Isaiah chattered beside him, questions about jets and flying and what it was like to go so fast. Marcus answered, voice finding strength. The ready room doors opened and heads turned. "Attention!" someone called, and the room snapped into focus. The lieutenant colonel held up a hand. "At ease. This is Marcus Thompson, call sign Reaper 6. Some of you have studied his missions. All of you have benefited from his tactical innovations." The room went quiet. Marcus felt 15 pairs of eyes assessing, measuring, trying to reconcile a legendary call sign with the man in stained work clothes holding a child's hand. A young lieutenant raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, is it true you completed the Nellis exercise with a 50-0 kill ratio?" Marcus blinked. 51-0, but that was a long time ago." The captain shook his head. "Sir, with respect, it's not a different world. We're carrying forward what you started." A woman major leaned forward. "Sir, the defensive maneuver you developed, the Reaper roll, it saved my life last year during a training accident. My instructor made me practice it until I could do it in my sleep. When my hydraulics failed, muscle memory took over." She stood, came to attention, saluted. "Thank you, sir." Others began standing one by one, until the entire room was at attention, silent tribute that said more than words. Marcus felt something crack inside him, a dam built from grief and shame and conviction that he'd failed by surviving when Alicia hadn't. Isaiah tugged on his hand, confused, but understanding something important was happening. Marcus pulled his son close, needing that anchor. When he spoke, his voice barely carried. "I was just doing my job, same as all of you." The major stepped forward. "Sir, that's the point. You did your job better than anyone thought possible. Then you walked away when you had to, and you're still here, still standing, still raising that boy, right? That's not failure, that's victory." A colonel entered, his presence shifting atmosphere from informal to official. Someone briefed him in whispers, and his expression transformed to respect. He crossed to Marcus, hand extended. "Colonel Davis, Squadron Commander, it's an honor, Captain Thompson." Marcus shook his hand, noting the colonel used his rank despite civilian clothes. "Just Marcus is fine, sir. I'm not active anymore." Davis shook his head. "Once a captain, always a captain. That doesn't change." He glanced at Isaiah. "This your boy?" Marcus nodded. "Isaiah, he's 6, wants to be a pilot." Davis crouched to Isaiah's level. "That right, son?" Isaiah nodded shyly. "Like my dad did, like my mom did." Davis's expression flickered. "Your mom was a pilot too?" Marcus's hand tightened on Isaiah's shoulder. "Captain Alicia Martinez. She died in a training accident 6 years ago." The room's energy shifted. Celebration giving way to something more solemn. These people understood loss. They'd all known someone who didn't come back, all carried names that lived forever in silence between missions. Davis stood, bearing formal. "Captain Martinez, I knew of her work. She was instrumental in developing current electronic warfare protocols. I'm sorry for your loss. The Air Force lost 2 exceptional officers that day, one to death, one to grief. It was recognition that Marcus's departure hadn't been cowardice, but survival, that sometimes the bravest thing a warrior could do was lay down their weapon and learn to live again. Isaiah pressed against his father's leg. The colonel made a decision. Captain Thompson, would you speak to my pilots? Share perspective that doesn't come from manuals. Marcus hesitated, but he thought about Alicia, how she'd always pushed him to share what he knew. I'm not sure what I could tell them. Davis smiled. Tell them what it's like after. After the career ends and you have to figure out who you are when flying isn't an option. They need to see there is an after, and it's worth fighting for. Isaiah settled into a chair with his toy jet. Marcus stood at the front, feeling exposed. In the air, he'd had training and procedures. Here, he just had his truth. I never wanted to stop flying, Marcus began. I left because my brain stopped cooperating, because nightmares got so bad I couldn't trust myself in the cockpit. Losing Captain Martinez broke something in me. I blame myself, even though the accident review said I couldn't have prevented it. His voice cracked. The doctors called it survivor's guilt. I called it hell. For 6 months, I couldn't sleep, couldn't look at the sky without seeing her jet going down. I had a choice: stay in, ride a desk, watch others do what I loved, or leave, try to build something new, focus on my son. I chose Isaiah. I chose being present over being important. Some days that choice feels like the hardest mission I ever flew. He looked at the young lieutenant. That exercise wasn't about being better. It was about refusing to lose. Every target eliminated was someone who couldn't shoot down my wingmen. That's what being a pilot is. Not glory or adrenaline, but absolute refusal to leave anyone behind. But sometimes you lose people anyway, and you have to find a way to live with that. Isaiah was watching his father, hearing things he'd been too young to understand before. Marcus wondered what story the boy would tell himself about this day. I work as a mechanic now. I fix cars for people who barely notice me. I get paid less than my expertise is worth. My son and I live in an apartment where the heat doesn't always work, and we shop at thrift stores, and sometimes we eat cereal for dinner. By every measure society uses, I'm a failure. He let that word hang. But here's what I've learned. Failure is life viewed from the wrong angle. I might have lost my career, but I gained being there when Isaiah takes his first steps into whatever future he chooses. I might have lost respect of people who only value you for what you do, but I gained ability to see who someone really is beneath surface judgments. I might have lost the identity I'd built my life around, but I gained chance to discover who I am when all titles are stripped away. The major spoke up. Sir, do you regret leaving? Marcus considered the question honestly. Every single day, but I also don't regret it at all. Both things are true. I miss flying like I'd miss breathing, but watching Isaiah grow up, being the parent he needs, that's worth the sacrifice. Not easier. Not what I'd choose if the world gave me different options, but worth it. He gestured around. Hold on to this as long as you can. Fly every mission like it's your last, because one day it will be. But remember, there's life after flying. It's not a consolation prize. It's just different, still hard, still requires courage. He looked at Isaiah, and sometimes, if you're lucky, it comes with a co-pilot who makes turbulence worthwhile. Colonel Davis stood as Marcus finished, his applause starting a chain reaction. It wasn't polite ceremony, but genuine appreciation. As sound faded, Davis spoke. Captain Thompson, I'd like to make you an offer. We have a civilian consultant program for pilots who've left active duty but still have expertise. You'd help with tactical development, maybe run scenarios with newer pilots. Part-time, flexible around your current job and your son's schedule. Interested? Marcus felt the offer land like a fighter jet touching down after a long mission. Solid, real, possible. It wasn't flying, Would never be flying, but it was a way back into the world he'd loved, recognition that his knowledge still had value. He thought about Isaiah, about providing better than broken heat and cereal dinners. He thought about Alicia, about what she'd say. She'd tell him to take it, to stop punishing himself with poverty because he'd survived when she hadn't. Yes, sir. I'm interested. The logistics took another hour. Paperwork, background checks, scheduling. Other pilots cycled through, introducing themselves, sharing stories about how Marcus's innovations had filtered through training. By the time they returned to the terminal, Marcus felt emotionally exhausted but somehow lighter. Victoria was still there, waiting, her expression unreadable. She approached slowly, like someone approaching danger they'd underestimated. "Mr. Thompson." Her voice had lost earlier disdain, replaced by something that might have been contrition. Marcus waited, not making it easy. Isaiah pressed against his side, protective. Victoria continued, words clearly difficult. "I owe you an apology. I judged you based on superficial things, your clothes, your circumstances. I was wrong, clearly, profoundly wrong." It was a corporate apology, rehearsed and careful, designed to mitigate liability. Marcus had heard enough to recognize the pattern. "You didn't know," he said simply. Victoria shook her head. "That's not an excuse. I should have treated you with basic decency regardless. I was cruel to you and your son. I'm sorry." The apology hung between them. Marcus realized she was waiting for forgiveness or absolution. He didn't give her either. "Isaiah," he said, "go look at those model planes." The boy obeyed, leaving them alone. Marcus turned his attention to Victoria. "You want to know what bothers me most? Not that you were rude to me, I'm used to that, but you were unkind to my son. You made him feel small and unwelcome in a space he had every right to occupy. You did it without thought because in your world, people like us don't matter enough to consider." Victoria's face flushed. "I know, Marcus held up a hand. "I'm not interested in excuses. But I am interested in whether you'll do better. Whether seeing me saluted will change how you treat the next person in worn clothes, or if you'll just file this away as an exception." It was harsh, but Victoria had hurt his child. Her discomfort was a fraction of what Isaiah experienced every day. Victoria met his eyes, and for the first time he saw something real, actual shame, actual recognition of harm. "You're right about all of it. I've built my identity around being superior. Used wealth as the measuring stick because it's quantifiable and favorable to me. I've probably done to hundreds what I did to you today, and I never thought about it because they couldn't fight back." She paused. "I'd like to say this transformed me, but that would be another superficial response. Real change takes time, but I can start by doing better with the next interaction, until treating people with dignity becomes automatic." It was the most honest thing she'd said all day. Marcus found himself nodding. "That's all any of us can do. Start where we are and try to be better tomorrow." The airline representative appeared, announcing their aircraft was cleared. Passengers stirred, ready to return to normal lives, where this interlude would become dinner party anecdote. For Marcus, it felt like the opposite. Not departure from real life, but collision between two versions of himself he'd thought were separate forever. They boarded in the same order they'd left, but everything had shifted. The flight attendant smiled warmly at Isaiah, asked if he'd enjoyed the fighter jets. Victoria took her seat without complaint or phone calls. Marcus settled into 12F with his son, the leather no more or less expensive than before, but somehow the seat felt like it fit differently, like he'd earned the right to occupy it through something more substantial than a courtesy upgrade. Isaiah pulled out his toy jet, but just held it carefully, looking at it with new understanding. "Dad," he said quietly, "were you scared when you flew for real?" Marcus thought about lying, about preserving heroic image. Then he thought about the promise he'd made to Alicia. Always tell Isaiah the truth. Terrified. Every single time. But being scared doesn't mean you don't do the thing. It means you do it anyway because someone's counting on you. Isaiah processed this, young face serious. Like how you take care of me even when it's hard? Marcus felt his throat tighten. Yeah, buddy. Exactly like that. His son leaned against him, toy jet clutched between them like a promise. I think you're still brave, Dad, even without the plane. It was the simplest statement, delivered with child certainty, and it undid something in Marcus that had been tightly wound for 6 years. He wrapped his arm around his son and let himself feel proud, not of past, but of who he was managing to be in the present. The flight to Houston was uneventful. Marcus dozed. Dreams for once not haunted by falling aircraft and Alicia's last transmission. Instead, he dreamed about the ready room, about pilots standing at attention, about Isaiah in the F-22 cockpit with his whole future spread before him. When they landed, Victoria was first to stand. But before leaving, she paused at Marcus's seat, pulled out a business card. My company. We're always looking for consultants with real operational experience. The work is civilian but meaningful. If you're interested, call me. The pay is substantially more than $8 an hour. She didn't wait for response, just moved up the aisle. Isaiah saw the card. Is that the mean lady? Marcus smiled. Yeah, buddy, but maybe she's trying to be less mean. It was the kindest interpretation, possibly more generous than Victoria deserved. They collected their single duffel from the carousel and made their way to long-term parking. Marcus's truck was a 15-year-old Ford with replaced transmission and a prayer holding it together. The truck started on the third try, engine coughing to life with reluctant determination. Isaiah buckled in, arranging his toy jet on the dashboard. Marcus adjusted the rearview mirror, catching his reflection, older than he felt, more worn than he wanted, but somehow more solid than that morning. The steel band caught light. Reaper 6. It didn't define him anymore, but it was part of him, a chapter in a story still being written. The drive home took 90 minutes through Houston traffic. Marcus lived in the eastern part of town, where rent was cheap. Their apartment complex was beige, fading to resignation, parking lot with potholes, broken security gate. Marcus parked in spot 17B, right under a tree that dropped sap but provided shade. Isaiah was tired now, adrenaline wearing off. Marcus carried him upstairs, the duffel over one shoulder, his son's weight warm and trusting. Their apartment was exactly as they'd left it, small and clean, furniture from thrift stores. But home. Marcus had done his best to make it welcoming. Walls had Isaiah's crayon drawings of jets and stick figures. The refrigerator held magnets from every place they'd visited. The couch sagged and the bathroom door didn't quite close, but it was theirs. He tucked Isaiah into bed, still mostly dressed, too tired for proper pajamas. His son was asleep before Marcus finished pulling up the blanket, toy jet clutched like a talisman. Marcus stood in the doorway watching his son breathe, feeling the familiar surge of love and terror that came with being solely responsible for another human's well-being. In the living room, Marcus sat on the sagging couch and pulled out his phone. 2 missed calls from his boss at Precision Auto, probably wondering why he'd missed his shift. A text from his landlord about rent. Nothing from anyone who'd called just to check on him. He'd systematically pushed away everyone after leaving the Air Force. Easier to be alone than watch pity replace respect. But now, staring at his empty contact list, Marcus wondered if he'd made the right choice. Isolation protected him from judgment, but also from connection, from possibility that some people might have cared beyond his usefulness. He thought about the pilots today, how they'd treated him with honor despite circumstances, how they'd seen worth he couldn't see himself. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to rebuild something new. He pulled Victoria's business card from his pocket. It listed 12 titles and a phone number that probably connected to an assistant who'd screen calls. He could imagine the conversation already. But he also thought about Isaiah, about broken heat and cereal dinners, about the future he was trying to build from spare parts. Pride was expensive. If Victoria's guilt could translate into opportunity for his son, maybe that was worth swallowing. He set the card on the coffee table. Decision deferred. Tomorrow he'd call the colonel. Tomorrow he'd face his boss. Tomorrow he'd figure out navigation. Tonight he was just tired. Sleep found him on the couch, phone slipping from his hand. He dreamed of flying, but not nightmares. In this dream, he was teaching Isaiah to handle controls, small hands on the stick while Marcus's hovered nearby. Alicia was there too, not as ghost, but as presence in the co-pilot seat, smiling with pride. The sky was clear and infinite, Jet responding to Isaiah's touch like it had been waiting. When Marcus woke 3 hours later, the dream clung like morning mist, dissipating slowly, but leaving sense that maybe the future didn't have to be defined by loss. Maybe it could be defined by what came next, by choices made from here forward, by refusal to let one chapter's ending dictate the entire book's worth. 6 months later, Marcus stood in a Fort Stockton conference room, presenting tactical scenarios to senior pilots gathered for quarterly training. He'd taken the colonel's offer, spent months rebuilding connection to aviation through teaching. The work paid enough for a better apartment, one where heat worked and Isaiah had his own bedroom. He hadn't called Victoria. Her card still sat on his coffee table, reminder that some bridges weren't worth crossing. The consultant work was enough. It put real food on the table, bought Isaiah new clothes, allowed occasional luxuries like movies. More importantly, it gave Marcus back a piece of identity, reminded him he had value beyond turning wrenches. The pilots treated him with respect, asked questions assuming intelligence, listened because they recognized expertise came from lived experience rather than theory. Isaiah had adjusted with childhood resilience. He'd made friends at his new school, joined a soccer team Marcus coached, despite knowing nothing about soccer, stopped asking quite so often about the mom he barely remembered. The toy F-22 still sat on his nightstand, but had been joined by other interests, books about space, a used telescope, dreams extending beyond replicating his father's career. Marcus watched his son grow and felt parental pride mixed with awareness that Isaiah was becoming his own person. That was how it should be. That was what Alicia would have wanted. Not a son trapped by parents' legacy, but a child free to choose his own path. On weekends, without consulting duties, they'd drive to the base and watch jets take off, the roar a language they both understood. Isaiah would ask increasingly sophisticated technical questions, and Marcus would answer, sharing knowledge that once defined his existence and now served different purpose, connection with his son. The pilots he worked with became something like friends, relationships built on mutual respect. They invited him to squadron events, included him in informal gatherings, treated him like he still belonged even though active service had ended. It wasn't the same as flying, would never be, but it was enough. Some nights, Marcus still had nightmares. Alicia's voice on radio, helpless feeling of being grounded while she needed him, silence after her last transmission. But some nights, he slept through until morning, undisturbed. Those peaceful nights were becoming more frequent, as if his subconscious had finally received permission to heal, to acknowledge survival wasn't betrayal, and moving forward wasn't forgetting. One afternoon, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from unknown number. The message was from Victoria Sterling. "Mr. Thompson, I hope this finds you well. Your conversation 6 months ago prompted significant changes in our company culture. We've implemented blind resume screening and diversity initiatives. These are small steps, but they matter. I wanted to apologize again, properly, without expecting anything in return. What I did was inexcusable, and I'm working to be better. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know you made a difference." Marcus read it 3 times, trying to determine if it was genuine or sophisticated PR. In the end, it didn't matter. If Victoria had actually changed behavior, that helped people he'd never meet. That was worth more than cynicism. He typed brief response. "Thank you for the update. I'm glad something good came from a difficult day." He sent it, then deleted her contact. His value didn't come from being her redemption project. It came from showing up every day for his son, from teaching pilots who'd carry his knowledge into situations where it might save lives, from quiet dignity of building something from nothing. That evening, he picked Isaiah up from school, and they drove to their favorite taco truck for dinner, sitting at the battered picnic table while sunset painted orange and purple. Isaiah talked about his day, a test he'd aced, playground dispute he'd mediated, plans for science project. Marcus listened and felt grateful for mundane beauty of parenthood. As they ate, a woman approached, hesitant but determined. She wore a retail uniform, name tag still pinned. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was on that flight 6 months ago, the one that landed at the Air Force Base." Marcus's chest tightened. The woman continued, voice soft but earnest. "I saw what happened with those pilots. I heard what you said to that corporate woman. I just wanted to say thank you. My daughter and we're in similar situation. We don't have much, and people treat us like we're less than. Seeing someone stand up to that, seeing those pilots recognize your worth, it gave me hope that we're not invisible." She placed her hand briefly on his shoulder, then walked away. Isaiah looked up. "Who was that, Dad?" Marcus swallowed hard. "Just someone reminding me that we're never as alone as we think, buddy." They finished tacos in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who've been through storms together. On the drive home, Isaiah fell asleep, head tilted against window, Houston lights painting patterns across his face. Marcus drove carefully, thinking about the strange trajectory of 6 months. He'd boarded a plane as one version of himself, diminished, overlooked, convinced his best days were behind him. He disembarked as someone different, not because external circumstances changed, but because he'd been forced to confront the gap between who he was and who others assumed he was. That gap had always existed, but seeing it recognized by people whose judgment he respected had shifted something fundamental. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building, not the life he'd planned, but a life nonetheless, constructed from resilience and love and stubborn refusal to let loss have the final word. Back at the apartment, Marcus tucked Isaiah into bed in his own room, kissed his forehead, breathed in childhood scent that wouldn't last much longer. Then returned to the living room. The steel band on his wrist caught lamplight. Reaper 6. The call sign meant something different now, not memorial to who he'd been, but reminder that identity could expand rather than contract, that skills learned in one arena could transfer to another. That end of one mission simply meant beginning of the next. He'd never fly again. That door had closed permanently, but he could teach. He could parent. He could show his son and the pilots he mentored and strangers in terminals that worth existed independent of wealth or status or leather seats. That was different kind of flying. Earthbound, but no less important. Marcus pulled out his phone one last time, started typing messages to people he'd pushed away, old squadron members, friends from before Alicia's death. The messages were simple. "Hey, I know it's been long. I'm doing better now. No pressure to respond, but I wanted you to know I'm here if you want to reconnect." He sent them without overthinking. Some would respond, some wouldn't. That was fine. The point wasn't guaranteeing outcomes, but opening doors he'd nailed shut in grief. Sleep came easier that night, dreams undisturbed by sirens or falling aircraft. Instead, he dreamed of Isaiah growing up, of teaching him to drive and watching him graduate and eventually letting him go into whatever future he chose. He dreamed of classrooms full of pilots learning from his mistakes and triumphs. He dreamed of Alicia, not as ghost, but as memory sweetened by time, painful still, but no longer paralyzing. And he dreamed of himself, not the man he'd been, or lost, or feared becoming, but simply the man he was. Flawed and struggling and sometimes barely holding it together, but showing up anyway, putting one foot in front of the other, refusing to let the world's judgment define his worth or his son's future. In the dream, someone asked who he was, and he answered without hesitation, Marcus Thompson, father, teacher, mechanic, survivor, former pilot, future whatever comes next. It was enough. It had always been enough. He just hadn't known it until 30,000 feet above Texas. A salute reminded him what he'd forgotten, that the cost of a seat means nothing compared to the price some men pay in silence, and that sometimes being overlooked is just the world's way of testing whether you can see your own worth when no one else is looking.